The workshop had already begun to sleep when Daniel Carter wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the clock hanging crookedly on the wall. It was close to 11 at night, the kind of hour when even the city seemed tired of breathing. Outside, the streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across cracked pavement and abandoned storefronts. Daniel's body felt heavier than the tools he'd carried all day. His shoulders burned, his fingers throbbed, and his back ached with the familiar pain of a man who worked harder than life ever rewarded him. He had spent the day fixing cars whose owners always wanted more than they could pay for, negotiating patience instead of money, and reminding himself that honesty didn't always put food on the table. This little workshop, worn and forgotten, was all he had left after years of bad luck, rising rent, and dreams that never quite made it past survival. He shut off the main lights, grabbed his jacket, and told himself tomorrow would somehow be better, the way he told himself every night, when suddenly a weak car horn echoed outside, once, then again, hesitant, desperate, as if whoever pressed it wasn't asking for service but pleading for mercy. Daniel froze, torn between exhaustion and instinct, knowing he should ignore it but unable to silence the part of him that remembered what it felt like to be stranded when the world had already turned its back on you. When Daniel finally stepped outside, the cold air hit his face, sharp and unforgiving, and under the dim streetlight he saw a small white sedan parked awkwardly near the curb with its hood slightly open. Inside sat a young woman wearing blue hospital scrubs, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing holding her together. The moment she saw him, she jumped out, her movements rushed, her eyes wide with panic and fatigue. She introduced herself in a trembling voice, explaining that she was a nurse heading to her night shift, that her car had suddenly died, that there were no taxis around, and that patients were waiting for her. Daniel noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes, the hospital badge clipped to her pocket, and the way her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. He hesitated, feeling the weight of his own weariness press against her desperation, yet something about her reminded him of his mother, who had once worked endless hospital shifts, coming home late with tired feet and a brave smile, telling him that helping people mattered even when no one noticed. Against his better judgment and aching body, Daniel unlocked the shop again and told her to pop the hood. The relief on her face was immediate, almost painful to witness, as if he had already saved her before even touching the engine. Inside the workshop, the lights hummed back to life, illuminating oil-stained floors and walls lined with aging tools that had seen better days. Daniel worked in focused silence, checking the battery, tracing wires, listening closely to the engine as if it were speaking a language only he understood. Emily, he'd learned her name from the badge, stood quietly nearby, apologizing more than once for keeping him late, clearly used to kindness without conditions. As minutes stretched into nearly an hour, Daniel discovered the alternator was failing, something that would soon need replacement but could be temporarily fixed well enough to last the night. While he worked, Emily spoke softly about her long shifts, about how nurses were expected to give everything without complaint, about how some nights she felt invisible despite carrying lives in her hands. Daniel replied without looking up, admitting that mechanics felt much the same, working behind the scenes, keeping others moving while their own lives stayed stuck. When the engine finally purred back to life, Emily's eyes filled with tears, relief crashing over her like a wave. She asked how much she owed, fumbling through her wallet only to realize she didn't have enough cash, shame coloring her face. Daniel closed the hood gently and told her she could pay him another time, his voice calm, steady, almost casual, as if generosity were as natural to him as breathing. He waved away her protests, insisting she get to her patients, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that this simple decision would quietly alter the course of his life. As Emily drove away into the night, the red glow of her taillights fading into darkness, Daniel stood alone outside the workshop, the silence settling deep into his bones. He locked the door again, turned off the lights once more, and sat heavily on the old wooden chair by his workbench, finally allowing the exhaustion to claim him. He didn't feel heroic or proud. He felt tired, broke, and unsure how long he could keep going like this. Yet beneath all of that, there was a small, steady warmth in his chest, the quiet comfort of knowing he had done the right thing when it would have been easier not to. Daniel had no idea that the young nurse was connected to a world far beyond his own struggles. No idea that this late-night act of kindness would return to him in ways he couldn't imagine. For him, it was just another night, another stranger helped, another reminder that even in a life filled with hardship, compassion was something he could still afford. And as he closed his eyes for a moment in that empty shop, Daniel believed, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that kindness, given freely, might someday find its way back home. The days that followed that late night passed quietly for Daniel Carter, almost cruelly ordinary, as if the universe itself were pretending nothing important had happened. He opened the workshop each morning before sunrise, the cold air biting his fingers as he lifted the rusted shutter, and he worked until his muscles begged him to stop. Bills stacked up on the small desk in the corner, electricity, rent, loan reminders, all marked with red warnings he tried not to read too closely. The memory of the young nurse flickered through his mind now and then, mostly when he noticed the empty space in his cash drawer where her payment should have been, but he never regretted it. Regret was a luxury for people who could afford to look backward. One rainy afternoon, nearly a week later, Daniel received a letter taped to his shop door while he was out grabbing cheap coffee from a nearby stall. At first glance, he thought it was another notice from the city or a complaint from a neighbor, but the envelope was thick, clean, and bore the seal of a private hospital he recognized instantly, Rhodes Medical Center, one of the most advanced hospitals in the region. His heart tightened as he tore it open, expecting some kind of accusation or misunderstanding, yet inside was a simple printed invitation requesting his presence at the hospital the following morning to discuss a matter of appreciation. Daniel reread the words several times, convinced there had been some mistake, wondering if perhaps the nurse's car had broken down again, or if something he had done had gone wrong. He slept poorly that night, haunted by possibilities, replaying every detail of that repair, every bolt he tightened, every word he spoke, until the invitation felt heavier than any engine block he had ever lifted. When Daniel arrived at the hospital the next morning, he felt painfully out of place, his worn boots echoing against polished marble floors, his oil-stained jacket standing out among pressed suits and spotless uniforms. He followed the directions on the invitation to a private conference room, each step feeding his anxiety, until the door opened and he saw Emily standing there, her face lighting up the moment their eyes met. She looked different in daylight, still tired, but composed, confident, as if the hospital walls themselves gave her strength. Before Daniel could say a word, she thanked him again, this time without tears, but with a firmness that suggested her gratitude had deepened into something more deliberate. She explained that the night he helped her, she had arrived just in time to assist with an emergency surgery, one that required every available hand, one that saved a life hanging by a fragile thread. As she spoke, a tall, silver-haired man entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Emily introduced him as her father, Dr. Harold Rhodes, founder and chief director of the hospital, a name Daniel recognized instantly from billboards and charity drives he'd seen around the city. Daniel's stomach dropped as realization crashed over him. This was no ordinary nurse, and this meeting was no coincidence. Dr. Rhodes listened carefully as Emily recounted the story of the broken car, the late hour, and the mechanic who stayed behind when he didn't have to, his expression unreadable but intense. When she finished, the room fell silent, and Daniel felt smaller than ever, bracing himself for judgment, unsure whether he was about to be thanked, questioned, or dismissed. Dr. Rhodes finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy with authority, saying that in his decades of running hospitals, he had learned that skills saved lives, but character sustained them. He explained that countless people worked for him, many talented, many kind in words, but few demonstrated compassion when no reward was promised and no one was watching. What Daniel had done, he said, was not a transaction, it was a choice, and choices revealed the truth of a person far more clearly than resumes or titles ever could. Daniel tried to downplay it, insisting he had simply done what anyone should do, but Dr. Rhodes shook his head, pointing out that most people walked away when helping became inconvenient. He then revealed that Emily had insisted on finding Daniel, not to repay a debt, but to make sure the kindness she received did not disappear into silence. Dr. Rhodes offered Daniel something that left him speechless: full medical coverage for life through the hospital, a business development grant to upgrade his workshop, and a no-interest loan to relocate to a safer, more visible area of the city. Daniel struggled to process the words, his hands trembling as he asked why they would do so much for a stranger. Dr. Rhodes answered simply that societies collapsed not from lack of money, but from lack of humanity, and when he encountered someone who still possessed it, he believed in protecting and multiplying it. Emily watched quietly, her eyes reflecting relief rather than pride, as if this outcome mattered less than the principle behind it. As Daniel left the hospital that day, the world felt strangely altered, as though the same streets he'd walked for years now carried a different weight beneath his feet. The offer still felt unreal, like a dream that would dissolve the moment he returned to his dusty workshop, yet something inside him had shifted permanently. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked like a narrowing tunnel of survival but an open road filled with cautious hope. He understood that accepting help did not erase his struggles or redefine who he was. It honored the values that had carried him through them. That night, as he closed the shop once again, Daniel looked at the empty space where the nurse's car had once stood and realized that kindness, when given freely, had a way of returning with purpose rather than pity. He didn't yet know how deeply his life would change, how far the ripple of that single decision would travel, or how many others would eventually be touched by it, but he knew one thing with certainty. The night he stayed late had not ended when the engine started, it had only just begun. Daniel Carter didn't accept the offer immediately, not because he doubted the sincerity behind it, but because for a man who had spent most of his life surviving without a safety net, the idea of sudden security felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. In the weeks that followed the hospital meeting, he continued opening his workshop before sunrise, working with the same discipline and humility that had carried him through years of struggle, yet everything felt subtly different. The grant paperwork sat unopened on his desk for days, the medical coverage card untouched in his wallet, as if acknowledging them too quickly might somehow break the spell. Customers noticed the change in him, not confidence exactly, but a steadiness, a quiet assurance that hadn't been there before. When the hospital's business consultants eventually visited his shop, they didn't speak down to him or try to reshape him into something artificial. Instead, they listened, asking how he wanted his workshop to grow and what kind of mechanic he believed the city needed. For the first time, Daniel was being asked not just to work harder, but to dream carefully. He spoke of honesty, of fair prices, of training young people who couldn't afford trade school, and of creating a place where no one felt ashamed for needing help. The consultants nodded, surprised by the clarity of his vision, and within months, Daniel relocated to a brighter, safer location, upgraded his equipment, and hired 2 apprentices from struggling neighborhoods nearby. Though his income improved, he refused to forget the fragile version of himself who once counted coins at night, reminding his employees daily that skill meant nothing without integrity. Emily continued working long hospital shifts, but her relationship with Daniel evolved into something quietly meaningful, not bound by obligation but by mutual respect. She visited the new workshop often, sometimes just to sit and talk during lunch breaks, other times to check in on the apprentices she had helped Daniel connect with healthcare resources through the hospital. Their conversations were never dramatic, yet deeply grounding, 2 people who understood exhaustion, responsibility, and the invisible weight of caring for others. Emily admitted that before the night her car broke down, she had begun to feel cynical, worn thin by bureaucracy and privilege she hadn't chosen but benefited from, and that Daniel's refusal to treat her differently after learning who she was reminded her why she had become a nurse in the first place. Daniel, in turn, confessed that accepting help had been harder than offering it, that pride and fear often disguised themselves as independence, and that learning to receive kindness without guilt had been its own kind of healing. Over time, their connection grew stronger, not through grand gestures but through shared values, service, humility, and the belief that dignity should never depend on status. They didn't rush anything, knowing life had already taught them the cost of impatience, but it became clear to those around them that whatever path they walked, it would be built on understanding rather than illusion. Years passed, and Daniel's workshop became known not just for quality repairs but for second chances. Young men and women who had nowhere else to go learned the trade under his guidance, many of them discovering discipline and self-worth for the first time. Daniel partnered with the hospital to offer free vehicle maintenance for night shift medical staff once a month, a quiet tribute to the moment that changed everything. When asked by local reporters how his business had grown so successfully, Daniel never mentioned grants, connections, or opportunity. He spoke instead about choosing compassion even when it was inconvenient, about staying late when walking away would have been easier. His story spread slowly, organically, inspiring others not because it promised rewards, but because it revealed the unexpected power of ordinary decency. Meanwhile, Dr. Harold Rhodes watched from a distance, satisfied not because his resources had transformed a man's life, but because they had amplified what was already there. He often said that wealth should function like a mirror, reflecting values, not replacing them, and Daniel Carter had proven that generosity, when aligned with character, could strengthen an entire community rather than distort it. On the anniversary of that late night, Daniel stood alone in his workshop after closing, the hum of the lights and the familiar scent of oil grounding him in memory. He thought of the man he used to be, tired, uncertain, doing good quietly without expectation, and realized that man still lived inside him, unchanged by success or recognition. Emily joined him, handing him a small framed photo she had kept all these years, a snapshot taken from a security camera the night her car broke down, showing a mechanic under a dim streetlight, sleeves rolled up, working without knowing anyone was watching. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, emotion tightening his chest, understanding finally that the night he stayed late hadn't changed his life because of who Emily was, but because of who he had chosen to be. As he turned off the lights and locked the door, Daniel smiled, not because his struggles had disappeared, but because his purpose had become clear. In a world that often measured worth by profit and power, he had learned that the smallest choices, made with sincerity, could echo louder than ambition ever could, and that sometimes, staying late for a stranger was enough to light the way forward for an entire lifetime.